There's always been something innately horrifying about both the flood from the Halo universe and the markers from the Dead Space franchise. Something uniquely disturbing that goes beyond the typical fear associated with the imminent threat of total annihilation imposed by such galactic or universal adversaries. Today we'll be attempting to explain just what makes these particular enemies of humanity so distinctly petrifying, above the seemingly superficial menace provided by other similar parasitic antagonists, such as the Tyranids from Warhammer 40k or the Borg from Star Trek. For the purposes of this analysis, I'll be deconstructing both of these entities into three constituent tiers of fear, organized into ascending categories based upon the level of intimidation they inflict upon the human psyche. These are the individual, the existential, and the esoteric, with the final echelon providing the sole impetus for this video, the former two having been discussed ad nauseum in other media, though I'll be exploring them anyways to build a broader picture for those of you without prior introduction to the subject. I'll also be giving a brief summary of the in-universe history of both these forces, though this too has been undeniably discussed far more eloquently by the bevy of lore-specific channels plastered about YouTube. And I'm sure most of you have been inundated with such titles if you managed to stumble across a video like this in the first place. But again, for the sake of presenting this examination in a relatively self-contained manner, I digress. Firstly, the Flood. The Flood are an organic, parasitic Gestalt consciousness that was first introduced as an auxiliary antagonist aboard the eponymous Halo ring depicted in Halo Combat Evolved, appearing subsequently in both Halos 2 and 3, as well as Halo Wars, making their final debut within the main franchise as of the time of recording this video during Halo Wars 2, though they've also been portrayed extensively through surrounding media, notably the novel Halo: The Flood, as well as the final entry in the collection of short stories titled Halo Evolutions, Essential Tales of the Halo Universe, the latter still my personal all-time favorite depiction of them. We, as the audience, quickly learn upon encountering these parasitic creatures that they are, in actuality, more grave a threat to the continued survival of this fictitious depiction of humanity than even the primary antagonist of the series, the genocidal religious hegemony known as the Covenant, and we spend a large portion of the first three games juggling the all-encompassing threat of consumption, even as humanity is brought to the brink of extinction by the Covenant. Throughout this struggle, we come to learn that the Forerunners, a race of highly advanced aliens that went extinct 100,000 years before the events of Halo, in fact built the rings we come to explore as a last-ditch effort to extinguish this mortal foe by destroying their food, namely, every creature with a complex enough nervous system to serve as a host for the parasite. When we encounter the Flood initially, they'd already existed within Halo since at least the time of the Forerunners, but by then, they'd already become a galactic menace. So what exactly were their origins? We know from Halo Cryptum, the first novel in the Forerunner saga by Greg Bear, that they are in some way descended from the Precursors, a race of originally extragalactic and transcendent custodians who tended and shaped life within the Milky Way according to a moralistic code known as the Mantle of Responsibility. These beings were immensely powerful, able to rearrange star systems, form non-corporeal structures that spanned across the stars, accelerate the development of sentient life, and even interact with the fabric of space-time itself. At some point during the eons under their watchful tutelage, they designated the Forerunners as the rightful heir to this mantle, although they later retracted the title, transferring it to humanity, who, by this point in 10 million BCE, had already become at least sentient, though the sources make no mention regarding our civilization's spacefaring status at this time. The Precursors had deemed the Forerunners as unworthy of such a legacy, and, in a display that demonstrates how their stewardship wasn't always benevolent, planned genocide of their former apprentices. Not entirely keen on being exterminated, the Forerunners rebelled, and, though we aren't entirely sure as to why, the Precursors seemingly allowed themselves to be nearly eradicated, a scattered few fleeing for the edges of known space, relegated to the annals of history. Over time, their memory and motives became increasingly forgotten, to the point that the Forerunner mythos came to believe that their creators had willingly abdicated their throne. But I digress. Suffice it to say, At some point around 1 million BCE, a now spacefaring humanity stumbled across the desiccated remains of several precursors, the beings having deconstructed themselves into some form of powder to be reassembled at a later date. But this mixture had mutated, corrupted by an eternity spent among the edges of space. This information remained unknown to the confused humans, who only saw a strange, seemingly inert substance, though it appeared to have a psychotropic effect on lower life forms, evoking docile behavior in several domesticated animals. Unfortunately, given time, these animals mutated into the first true flood forms, which began to spread rapidly after making the jump to sentient life. Horrifyingly, the parasites seemed to become increasingly intelligent with each subsequent infection, assimilating the some knowledge of its victims, allowing for an exponential increase in coordination and efficiency as they spread throughout ancient humanity's territory, producing a wave of desperate migrants that poured into the borders of a now dominant forerunner civilization. This had the unfortunate effect of instigating a war between the two powers, which culminated in the forced devolution of what remained of humanity in the aftermath, painting a target on the back of the somewhat weary forerunners as the flood came for them, too. After another 300 years of desperate conflict with the ever-increasing might of the flood, a frantic act of last resort was activated in the form of the Halos, eradicating all life within 3 radii of the galactic center, destroying both forerunner and flood alike. Life continued only through the diligence of a benevolent few forerunners who'd managed to store genetic and living samples of much of the galaxy's biodiversity aboard an installation nestled safely beyond the galaxy's edge, reseeding now barren worlds so that civilization might one day return. Ironically, this act of preservation extended to a few remaining contained flood samples, which would eventually provide the impetus for the outbreaks seen within the main campaigns of the Halo games. Short and sweet, right? Don't worry, the next one will be easier, though only because of the lack of expository material present in Dead Space canon. Alright, so, the markers, or the necromorphs. It's fairly difficult to make a distinction between the two, and even more self-defeating to try and classify either as a race or singular consciousness like the Flood. I'd be more willing to say that the markers themselves are some kind of esoteric form of life or intelligence, though their status as entirely organic or technological beings is unclear, to say the least. Firstly, some more history. The markers, and by extension the necromorphs, are the main antagonist of the Dead Space franchise, making their debut in, who would have guessed it, Dead Space, and subsequently appearing in Dead Spaces 2, 3, and finally in Dead Space Extraction, as well as a series of novels, comics, and even 2 feature-length made-for-TV films that compose the rest of the supplementary lore. From what is stated in the novel Dead Space Martyr, we know that the markers are at least 65 million years old, given the explanation that the original black marker discovered on Earth traveled from an unknown location aboard the asteroid that caused the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, coming to rest somewhere within the resultant Chicxulub crater off of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. We can assume that the markers are significantly older than this, based upon the timescale of human civilization as well as the average speed of such an asteroid as it passes between solar systems. This hypothesis should be taken with a grain of salt, however, considering that, although it's never been explicitly mentioned, it is possible that the markers in their final evolution, the Brethren moons, are able to propagate themselves at relativistic or even superluminal speeds as they spread throughout the universe. Though the wiki explicitly mentions that the former travels at strictly sublight speeds. Given the somewhat sudden appearance of the armada of moons over Earth at the end of Dead Space 3, it seems somewhat reasonable to conclude that perhaps the moons are capable of faster-than-light travel, but that is relatively tangential unless we posit that they carry new markers at least part of the way to their intended destinations. Additionally, their presence becomes significantly more ancient if we consider that the black marker on Earth is doubtlessly not the earliest of those we are known to have encountered, again considering the ending of Dead Space 3. But since we know that the red markers can trigger convergence events, it is unclear whether this armada of moons is comprised of the remnants of other human colonies having already underwent the process, or simply the remains of other unfortunate species, because we are given no frame of reference regarding the status of humanity's other worlds in the games. but provided with the knowledge that the aliens of Tau Volantis had already undergone convergence 2 million years before it occurred on Earth, it is implied that there exists some separate, common progenitor, but that is purely speculation. Suffice it to say, the markers are old, very old. They are also apocalyptically insidious, altering the genetic structure of life on any world unlucky enough to harbor one, cultivating and uplifting species until they are ready to be consumed in some sort of entirely convoluted method of reproduction. There are only 2 recorded instances detailing the manifestation of the marker's plans for a civilization, the aforementioned Tau Volantis along with humanity itself, but the overall process is remarkably slow. Its length may, however, depend on the biological complexity of a host planet. For example, if a marker landed on a planet already populated by an intelligent spacefaring civilization, it might immediately begin transmitting the signal to bring about transforming its hosts into necromorphs. Speaking of, I've neglected discussing that topic so far, though it is a centrally important phenomenon with regards to the process. As far as we are told, the markers operate by emitting some kind of signal out across a planet, shaping and guiding their future food into a rapidly overdeveloped, ravenously fecund race, to ensure that they produce the conditions necessary to begin experiencing resource and specifically power deficiencies. Of course, they, as an intelligent race, will develop increasingly efficient means of power generation, though inevitably the marker will reveal itself, posing as a panacea for the now strained species' needs, ensuring that its future host will replicate it, placing its copies conveniently within every corner of their burgeoning interstellar empire, especially near areas of high population density, given that they tend to be the largest consumers of energy. At this point, the signal the marker emits changes frequency, broadcasting a wave that somehow alters dead flesh through a kind of recombinant infection, reanimating corpses into twisted killing machines alongside its now plentiful copies, which are colloquially termed red markers, given their coloration. Even with a complete lack of dead tissue to convert, the markers are able to alter the psychology of live specimens, inducing mania and hysteria to the point where suicide or homicide is inevitable, providing a further source of bodies. Once a critical mass of flesh has been accumulated, the signal will change once again, raising the necromorphs along with portions of the planet's crust into space, the orbiting collection of matter accreting into a planetoid, with the marker situated at its center, heralding the birth of its ultimate stage of maturation, the Brethren Moon. It is, again, left unspecified whether or not the Brethren Moons preceded the markers or not. Much of the undefined parameters of these life forms are left unexplained, seeing as the mystery itself lends to the horror. The one fan theory conjectures that the first marker was some technological development made by an unknown species that eventually turned malevolent, triggering the first convergence event and sending out copies of itself to continue their twisted crusade across the stars. This cycle of convergence and duplication eventually led to one inauspiciously impacting ancient Earth, leading to the events of Dead Space eons later. If each moon is a singular black marker, then perhaps the armada shown at the end of Dead Space 3 was the remains of dozens of former species, all grown and culled by their markers. Certainly a bone-chilling answer to Fermi's paradox. With all of that exposition out of the way, we can finally take a look at the manner in which these cosmic threats provide their uniquely insomnia-inducing terror. As mentioned, I've separated the analysis into 3 tiers, the first being the individual. This is the grade in which these entities share the most commonality with other antagonists, the immediate physical threat provided by both shared with everyone from stormtroopers to the Mangalores from the Fifth Element, though they certainly have better lethality rates than either of those examples. Because of their nature, they obviously have more in common with any generic zombie outbreak from other media, especially given the whole resurrecting and infecting thing, but most of these more conventional depictions lack the added intelligence provided by either enemy. Of course, anyone who's played through Halo CE or Dead Space will be familiar with the personal threat provided by the various infection or combat forms of the Flood, as well as the myriad of necromorph types, memories of slashing talons, grotesque tendrils, and exploding flesh conjured by the very mention. But this threat is supplemented by several distinctive abilities. For the Flood, their capacity to become more intelligent as they progress provides much of the added menace, given that they can become spacefaring if given enough time, notably evidenced in the final battle of the Forerunner Flood War, where a fleet of Forerunner vessels overrun by the singular consciousness of the Flood attempted to stop the firing of the Halo array. Additionally, since they retain the memories and skills of their sapient hosts, they are able to use the weaponry of their victims, their martial prowess improving with each defending soldier consumed. Individual necromorphs, on the other hand, lack those properties. Their group consciousness, big air quotes here, is more like a crude animalistic puppetry show, only imbued with a feral hunger for blood without the ability to learn or employ complex tactics. This would appear to impinge upon the upper boundary of their reach for a singular outbreak, as they are limited by the range of the marker's control. Though this would seem to be a glaring detriment towards their efficacy, much of it is augmented by the psychic effects of the marker, confusing and hindering any potential resistors to its machinations, as shown particularly in several prominent characters within the Dead Space universe, including the main protagonist. Another seeming weakness would be the marker itself, a vulnerably inanimate object before its transformation into a Brethren moon, but we know from the film Dead Space Aftermath that, even if an individual is able to subvert both the hordes of necromorphs and the mental agony of the marker, and managing to destroy the marker to some extent, its fragments, even to a microscopic level, contain the totality of the marker's abilities. This is nearly identical to the Flood's properties, with even a single surviving Flood spore holding the potential for a future outbreak, though it apparently regresses in intelligence as its accumulated biomass is destroyed. Moreover, the marker's ability to create new vectors of infection, i.e. dead tissue, through its telepathic manipulation allows it to infect isolated hosts, whereas the Flood required direct contact, be it inhalation of an airborne spore or transmission by infection forms. As an aside, though I keep contrasting the two factions, this isn't meant to be some kind of comparison video. When I point out these differences, it is generally applicable to say X can do this, whereas Y and the rest of conventional fictitious antagonists lack such abilities. Just as a heads up, because I'm going to continue doing it. Nevertheless, it isn't a stretch to say that you and I, completely devoid of Mjolnir armor, energy swords, engineering suits, or plasma cutters, would almost certainly be joining the hordes of either faction following a swift death. Moving on then, the Existential. Most of this information overlaps with the previous section, with it being the aggregated individual threat as it pertains to humanity at large, its superimposed danger signaling the eradication of our species as a whole. Again, this menace is not unique to other real and fictitious enemies, like I mentioned previously the Tyranids and the Borg, with all of them sharing a common theme of forced assimilation into their ranks. What elevates this category above the previous is precisely this notion, that one might need fight their fallen comrades upon their infection, watching terrified as the faces of their compatriots twist grotesquely upon their unwilling incorporation into the deadly procession. They are distinct above other conventionally genocidal combatants for this reason, with, say, factions like the Covenant, unable to directly use our own strength against us, a clear line distinguishing them as a wholly external threat. The fear instead comes from within, the unnerving truth that these foes are us, in a way. Their distinctly human visages barely perceptible as they mutate, reflecting our own worst capabilities in a mirror, darkly. This chilling truth is displayed clearly in both Halo and Dead Space, though it manifests itself in several unique ways. For example, the Flood's ability to mimic what we would recognize as seemingly human characteristics, such as their famous tactical withdrawal during the Forerunner-human conflict, in which they retreated in order to allow these two species to weaken themselves in preparation for the Flood's inevitable return, or more notably, the alliance forged between the Gravemind aboard Installation 05 and the main protagonist of Halo 2, its deadly intelligence unabashedly on display as it tried to stop the firing of the Halos to allow itself to continue spreading. These instances are exemplars of how unique the Flood are as an enemy, raising them above the typical animalistic tendencies of other zombie-like adversaries, the Markers included, though both the Flood and the Markers have been shown to belay immediate gratification in promise of a larger bounty, with the latter needing to traverse the lengthy process of first uplifting their hosts. Again, considering the Flood, they are capable of another deadly existential ability, the Logic Plague, As mentioned, the propensity for either entity to use our own power against us cannot be understated, even within the context of a fictitious humanity's continued technological accession. One of the primary advantages utilized by the current iteration of humanity within the main Halo games is their advanced artificial intelligences. These synthetic beings capable of outthinking even the smartest individual human, used to coordinate the vast intellectual demands of maintaining an interstellar empire. Everything from running a city to organizing synchronous naval attacks to great effect. We know from the expanded material that the forerunners that preceded us were even more adept at creating these constructs, the most famous of which coming to be known as mendicant bias, a supremely intelligent contender-class ancilla that was used to arrange nearly the entirety of the forerunners' defense against the emergent parasite during their war. From most people's perspectives, this would seem to be an appropriate measure, given that such a construct was obviously immune to infection. But such blind assumptions were quickly disproven. In conjunction with essentially running the war, mendicant bias was at some point instructed by the Forerunners to conduct an interrogation of a being known as the Primordial, what was later understood to be one of the last surviving precursors, heavily decayed and mutated in its aeons of isolation within a stasis capsule. Already sensing some sort of connection between this ancient race of galactic custodians and the emergent flood, the AI probed the being for answers, which it seemed to give quite truthfully during their 43-year-long conversation. Ironically, when finally armed with the information about the Flood's true nature, as well as both the Precursor's connection to them and a more precise explanation regarding the mantle of responsibility, Mendicant Bias was convinced by the legitimacy of the Flood's cause, voluntarily allowing itself to succumb to the logic plague, a state of rampancy induced in artificial intelligences, which causes them to behave contrary to the constraints instilled by their programming. This ability to transcend even the limitations of their biological methodology of infection adds another layer of danger to their character, again provided thanks to their dangerously competent intelligence. The markers, as mentioned, lack a fiendish propensity for restraint once awakened, as well as the acute talent for technological manipulation afforded to the Flood, though they exhibit several properties shown in the games that add to their consideration within this particular tier. Most of you familiar with the franchise are probably wondering why I've neglected to mention the Church of Unitology up until this point, given their central role in the series, but better late than never. In my earlier summarization, I brought up that once a marker deems a race as having reached a sufficient population density and relative intelligence, that is, spacefaring and strapped for resources, it makes its presence known, so that the unwitting host species will replicate the marker across their territory, the insidious obelisk posing as a limitless energy source, this duplication ensuring maximal effectiveness when convergence is triggered. Within the Dead Space continuity, the marker on Earth made itself known in the year 2214, with the United Earth Government, or UEG, contracting a team of scientists headed by anthropologist Michael Altman to investigate a signal propagating from the Chicxulub crater. Upon the marker's discovery, the mania induced by it compelled much of the team to begin worshipping the relic as a deity, inadvertently beatifying Altman as he seemed almost unaffected by its maddening whispers. After being assassinated by the UEG for his attempt to blow the whistle on their secretive operations, he was posthumously sanctified as the messianic figure within the pantheon of the now rapidly spreading religion of Unitology, which came to believe that Altman had intentionally disseminated knowledge of the marker's existence as a matter of faith with respect to its holiness. In actuality, he'd tried to stop the marker, replicating its genetic code and signal in a desperate bid to silence the object, especially after witnessing the ensuing outbreak of necromorphs aboard the research facility. After successfully quieting the relic, he destroyed the surrounding station, sinking the marker back into the depths of the water below, hoping that it would never be wakened again. This, alongside the destruction of markers 3A and 12B at the hands of a particularly driven engineer during the finales of Dead Space 1 and 2, respectively, are the only known instances in which a marker's signal was able to be temporarily suppressed, though it is assumed that at least the original black marker, as well as marker 3A, were able to continue operation after their deactivation, given the events of Dead Space Aftermath. But again, I digress. Suffice it to say, the initial founders of Unitology, some under the influence of the marker's psychic grasp, managed to induct a large swath of humanity into the Church's loving ideals, promising that the marker will explain both the origin and meaning of life, as well as hold the key to discovering the secret to eternal life. From an out-of-universe perspective, it's almost humorous to note the truth in such words, even if the actuality is far more twisted and horrific than I'd imagine the average unitologist is told. Though the games explore several key characters that belong to the Church, we are never explicitly told how much its adherents at large are privy to the full understanding of the marker's implication, and we see several conflicting examples within canon. Everything from believers sharing the same confused terror at the sight of the necromorphs as non-believers, to some, such as Chalice Mercer from the original Dead Space, as well as Samuel Irons from the film Dead Space Downfall, recognizing and accepting the creatures as the perceived next step towards convergence, which is ironically idolized as the transition into eternal life by Church doctrine. Whilst whether or not the followers as a whole understand the actuality of the marker's implication is unclear, we are told for certain that the highest priests of the Church are privy to the truth of the markers, though given the time and zealotry required for one to climb the ranks of such an organization, it would be understandable that even this earth-shattering truth may not be enough to dissuade their faith, or perhaps reluctant prelates are quote-unquote removed if they prove unwilling during their accession. The concept of a religion formed around the worship of the planned destruction of one's race isn't unique to Dead Space, with mentions of flood-worshipping cults given within auxiliary media of the Halo universe, and even several real-life analogies of death-worshipping religions coming to mind. But Dead Space certainly provides the most complete and compelling depiction. It is a testament to the marker's unnerving allure as a byproduct of its manipulative abilities that an entire population of humanity worships their prospective consumer by the events of the main Dead Space trilogy, and the Church's burial practices, which involves the fervent preservation of corpses in preparation for this rebirth, hints at how deep the marker's grotesque tendrils have gone to subtly change humanity in anticipation of convergence. Certainly existential, to say the least. Finally, the Esoteric. The label for this ultimate echelon in the list is ungainly, to put it mildly, given my inability when it comes to producing appropriate nomenclature. So what exactly do I mean by it? Well, to use a popular analogy, if we consider the collective terror imposed by either entity, we might say that the individual threat is the tip or hummock of the iceberg, the existential being its bummock, the submerged part, with the esoteric being the jet black expanse of the ocean beneath, a separate medium entirely, the profound mystery instilled by such imagery rather fitting. Again, I'll be considering both the flood and the marker separately, but that isn't to underscore their dissimilarity, because the whole point of this analysis is to show that they are, together, more different with respect to other factions and beings than they are unique relative to each other. To begin, I think it's appropriate that we define the notion of panpsychism, a school of philosophical thought that describes the mind or consciousness as a fundamental aspect of reality. I considered discarding the term altogether from this exposition, given how broad a concept it has become, but after an arduous trek through overly abstract explanations, I'd figured I needed to mention it to continue on to the next, more relevant idea, that being constitutive cosmopsychism. Constitutive cosmopsychism is a branch belonging to the panpsychic system, which posits that individual consciousnesses, that which you and I are assumed to possess, is part of a larger cosmic consciousness that underlays all things. On a surface level, it seems a relatively silly concept. I mean, how can the universe be conscious? It's a thing, just like the chair I'm sitting on, but when we consider it through the lens of the Halo universe in specificity, it begins to become a distinct possibility. How, I hear you ask? Well, that brings us back to the ever-enigmatic precursors. As mentioned, they appear to operate at what some might term a higher mode of existence, unbounded by the limitations imposed onto their wards, and free to explore the non-substantive realms of neural physics and living time. The official canon defines their species as transsentient, though it fails to further elaborate as to what exactly that means. Regardless of how they are categorized, their wisdom is presented as almost tantamount to fact, and more relevantly, their wisdom led them to believe in a concept called the sweetness. Though not explicitly defined, with Halopedia itself saying that there are no human analogs to the term, it can most plainly be described as the idea of experience itself in a wildly general sense, though they specifically used it to refer to good and evil, joy and pain, and the myriad of sensations in between. They believed that emotion and consciousness at large was somehow radiated into the very fabric of the universe, and that our individual physical and emotional state was nothing but a pale mockery in comparison. This is evidently the reason for their seeming pacifism in the face of extinction at the hands of the Forerunners, believing that their suffering was a necessary and indeed natural component in the continuation of this sweetness. I believe that through their elevated mode of being, they were endowed with the confirmation of the constitutive cosmopsychic theorem, coming to understand that the universe itself was conscious, and that every being within was an extension of this unifying entity. That assumption would seem to explain much of their actions, their stewardship of life in the galaxy, an extension of what they interpreted as the will of the universe, as well as their refusal to retaliate against the Forerunners, opting instead to allow the experience of this central being to continue unobstructed by their hand. So, how exactly does this hypothesis contribute to the added terror of the Flood? Certainly, if what I assumed is true, then their end goal of total consumption seems to staunchly oppose the continuance of the sources of this sweetness, that being the continued sensations experienced by life at large, and an ultimate, universe-spanning flood hive would be incapable of anything other than silent stagnation, rid of further suffering to produce. But if we consider for a moment that the precursors, so intrinsically linked to the very fabric of the universe itself, were extensions of this cosmic entity as opposed to a distinct species, the picture becomes much clearer.
We are the Flood. There is no difference. Until all space and time are rolled up and life is crushed in the folds. No end to grief, war, or pain. In 101,000 centuries, unity again, and wisdom. Until then, sweetness.
These were the words spoken by the primordial to the Isodidact shortly before its death at his hands. The Flood are the precursors, and the precursors are the universe. Perhaps the fact that the Forerunners attacked the emissaries of this universal being, or simply an ironically coincidental change of mind, or even perhaps some kind of esoteric version of something as anticlimactic as an immune response, implored it to forcibly recount the vassalage it had given to life in the cosmos. But the message was unmistakably clear. Stepping back a little, even if this abstraction is a step too far, that instead the precursors are indeed the highest mode of existence in the Halo canon, rather than being a universal organism, they're certainly the closest thing to what we'd consider a conventional deity in the Halo universe. And given that their corrupted image in the form of the Flood was a singular consciousness, along with the fact that they are confirmed to be extragalactic, it isn't far-fetched to surmise that they had existed as extensions of a singular, universe-spanning entity. Perhaps not quite the esoteric manifestation of the universe, but as close to it as possible. A sort of first mover with regards to all life. Whatever the case, now mutated, they seem to have thrown out the concept of balance within their sweetness principle, happy to instead directly recoup on the deficit incurred by life's unchecked continuation without their watchful gaze, until finally, unity and wisdom. The markers make us consider a similar concept, though perhaps in a less metaphysically abstract sense. Rather than jumping to the slightly unfounded assumption of the universe itself being alive, I'm content to conject that the markers are, like the precursors, are some kind of universe-spanning things, directly responsible for the propagation of all other sentient races as a byproduct of their unique method of what can only be described as procreation. I say things when referencing them because I'm also less confident that they are a singular entity rather than an actual species, especially considering what little information we are provided explicitly refers to them as life forms. But in the quote-unquote dialogue between themselves and the protagonists in the Dead Space 3 DLC titled Awakened, they seem to have a singular voice, referring to themselves as we, which hints more concretely at the possibility that they also possess some sort of hive mind mentality. Regardless, they occupy a similar role relative to the Flood within the Dead Space universe, and since we are explicitly told that they are the reason and purpose for our existence, the esoteric nature of our terrifying relation to them is much more defined than it is with respect to the Flood. Even if neither faction is quite the actual will of a sentient universe, the distinction implied is marginal, and it is for this reason that they are so uniquely terrifying. Precisely because they are responsible for our existence, are gods in a way, provides a further, more chillingly fundamental question that we must ask ourselves. That is, are we wrong? That we should feel such intense terror at their efforts to assimilate us, when in actuality, their actions are simply part of the natural processes of these disturbing realities. It dehumanizes us, in a way, robbing us of any apparently misplaced notions of agency or entitlement to exist at all, and we become either the yoke of an emergent brethren moon, or the source of sweetness for the insatiable flood. We cannot point to a carnivorous organism and judge it for needing to consume others to survive, just as we cannot transpose that same adjudication onto either of these entities, given that self-preservation is such an intrinsic property to life as we know it. Not only that, but if we are indeed their creations, then what gives us the right to interfere with their will simply because we picked up some superfluous sense of survival during our development? To become someone's enemy is to know strife. To become one's own enemy is to know sorrow. But to become enemies with the very face of God himself is to know nothing, said some philosopher, probably. These possibilities are all uniquely disturbing, but the implication, rather than outright confirmation, of such world-shatteringly profound probabilities also adds to the level of fear conjured by resting on the precipice of the unknown, the unanswered. Because, if an answer is given, especially one as bleakly horrific as those explored, it would defeat the purpose of our personal justifications for continuing onwards even through the unenlightened frame of reference as characters living in either fictitious universe. Thus, leaving such information just beyond our grasps as the player is almost necessary. As an example, we are implicitly told through auxiliary references that the answers to these queries are so conclusively profound that they manage to even convince mendicant bias to join the flood, and compel members of both universes to commit suicide. We are not told outright what the cause for such actions is, but that's the whole point. That the answer in its entirety is so thoroughly twisted to convince people that the eternity of blackness just beyond the mortal coil is preferable, as opposed to continuing to resist, is indicative of the abstractly terrifying horror instilled by both the flood and the markers, and what makes them so unique in the realm of fictitious antagonists. I hope that this thoroughly disorganized analysis gave you something to consider when thinking about just what sets these two enemies apart from the rest. If you couldn't tell, I've spent considerable time mulling over the subject, but by all means, feel free to tell me your own perspectives in the comments. I'm always interested to hear other points of view. And with that, we're done. Show's over. You can go home. And now, back to my regularly scheduled self-induced insanity.